When did Jell-O wiggle its way into every American home? Was it always this cheap, this colorful, this wobbly? How did something that once required an entire kitchen staff and most of a day to prepare end up in a box that costs less than a cup of coffee? And why does nearly every American have a memory of it, whether they wanted one or not? If you'd tried to serve modern Jell-O at a fancy dinner party in the 1700s, you'd have been laughed out of high society, not for serving gelatin, mind you, but for serving it so crudely. Back then, gelatin desserts were the ultimate flex of the ultra-wealthy, a shimmering monument to having both money and servants to burn. This journey through Jell-O-esque conquest of America reveals how a failed cough syrup maker created an empire, why door-to-door salesmen changed food marketing forever, and how a wobbly dessert became both a symbol of American prosperity and, eventually, everything wrong with it. As these stories unfold, your thoughts might grow a bit softer, your breathing a bit deeper, and the day's edges might start to blur into something sweeter and simpler. For those who find these stories as oddly soothing as I do, you're welcome to subscribe for more bedtime histories. No pressure though, only if the mood strikes you. And hey, I'm curious. What's your earliest Jell-O memory? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one before bed. Before we begin tonight's journey back through time, take a moment to adjust your pillow just right. Maybe pull that blanket up a little higher. Let your shoulders drop. And as you settle in, imagine the soft wobble of history itself, always moving, never quite solid, but somehow holding its shape through the centuries. You're standing in a European manor house kitchen in the late 1700s, though kitchen doesn't quite capture the industrial operation happening here. The air is thick with steam and the constant smell of boiling bones. Beef bones, veal bones, pork knuckles, all simmering in massive copper pots that haven't stopped bubbling for nearly 2 days. The kitchen staff has been taking shifts, skimming the surface every hour, adding more bones, more water, maintaining exact temperatures. This is what making gelatin looked like before Jell-O, before convenience, before democracy came for dessert. You watch as the head cook, exhausted and covered in a fine sheen of meat-scented steam, carefully strains the liquid through cloth after cloth. Each filtering removes more impurities, more color, more of anything that might cloud the final product. The goal is something crystal clear, something that will set into a trembling, translucent masterpiece. The whole process takes nearly 3 days from start to finish. First, the bones have to be cleaned and roasted. Then comes the endless boiling, minimum 24 hours, but the best cooks insist on 36. The liquid reduces and reduces, concentrating into something thick and sticky. Then the clarifying begins, egg whites whisked in to gather impurities, more straining, more filtering. Historical records from manor houses and palace kitchens of the era describe gelatin making as one of the most labor-intensive preparations possible. A single fancy gelatin dessert might require the dedicated work of 3 or 4 kitchen servants, not to mention the cost of the bones and meat, which, honestly, most people would rather just eat. I mean, spending 3 days to turn perfectly good food into wobble seems a bit excessive even by aristocratic standards. Food historians still debate exactly when and where the first elaborate gelatin molds appeared. Some point to medieval Arabic texts describing similar preparations, others to Renaissance Italian courts. Still others insist the French perfected the art in the 1600s. What most scholars agree on is that by the 1700s, gelatin had become the ultimate status symbol across European high society, though the specific techniques and recipes varied wildly by region. The science behind it, though nobody understood it at the time, was all about collagen, that protein in connective tissues that turns into gelatin when heated in water. But in the 1700s, they just knew that if you boiled bones long enough, something magical happened. The liquid would transform into something that could hold its shape, capture other flavors, create edible architecture. You're watching the cook now add the flavoring, imported lemons from the Mediterranean, sugar from Caribbean plantations, spices that cost more than most people's monthly wages. Each ingredient carefully measured, carefully tasted. This isn't just food, it's alchemy, it's art. It's a statement that says, I can afford to turn a cow's knees into dessert. The molds themselves were equally impressive. Elaborate copper shapes in the form of castles, flowers, even miniature gardens. Some of the wealthiest households had molds specially commissioned, family crests rendered in copper, architectural landmarks, mythological scenes. The gelatin would be carefully poured in layers, sometimes clear, sometimes tinted with vegetable dyes or fruit juices, creating three-dimensional edible sculptures. According to contemporary accounts, these gelatin desserts were often the centerpiece of elaborate banquets, carried in with great ceremony, sometimes even with candles somehow incorporated into the design, lighting up from within like edible lanterns. Guests would gasp and applaud. It was dinner theater before dinner theater existed. The French called them gallies, the English jellies, but everyone understood them as symbols of profound wealth and sophistication. You needed the money for ingredients and equipment, the space for preparation, the servants to execute it, and perhaps most importantly, the time. Nobody working for a living could spend 3 days making dessert. Marie Antoinette reportedly loved elaborate gelatin desserts shaped like classical temples, complete with tiny gelatin columns that would tremble when the table was bumped. Though some historians question whether these specific accounts are accurate or embellished over time, the general extravagance is well documented. The irony wasn't lost on everyone even then. Some social commentators of the era pointed out the bizarre nature of the upper classes spending fortunes to eat clarified animal parts while the poor went hungry. But that was rather the point. Conspicuous consumption at its wobbliest. Interestingly, and this is where it gets properly weird, gelatin was also considered medicinal. Physicians of the era prescribed it for everything from digestive issues to joint problems. They weren't entirely wrong either, though their reasoning was more superstition than science. They believed that since gelatin came from bones and joints, it must be good for bones and joints. Sympathetic medicine at its finest. The servants, meanwhile, they got the leftover bones after all the gelatin had been extracted, made into basic broths and soups. Nothing fancy, nothing that would set or shimmer. Just the ghost of what the wealthy were eating upstairs. The hierarchy of food written in wobbles and transparency. This exclusivity would continue well into the 1800s. Even as the Industrial Revolution began changing everything else about how people lived and ate, gelatin remained stubbornly aristocratic. It simply took too much time, too much fuel, too much expertise to make it accessible to regular people. But change was coming. Down in America, where democracy was busy appending all sorts of European traditions, someone was about to look at this elaborate, exclusive, aristocratic dessert and think, what if everyone could make this? The bones were about to be democratized. The wobble was about to go wide. And it all started with a man who was actually trying to solve an entirely different problem. A man whose name most people have never heard, even though his invention would eventually wobble its way into nearly every American kitchen. You find yourself in Cooper's glue factory in New York. The year is 1845, and Peter Cooper has a problem. Actually, he has several problems, but the one that's about to change American dessert history involves massive amounts of leftover animal tissues from his glue-making operation. Cooper was already rich by this point. He'd made his fortune in glue and iron and real estate, the kind of diversified portfolio that would make him the Elon Musk of his era, minus the tweets. He'd even designed and built Tom Thumb, America's first steam locomotive. So when Peter Cooper looked at a pile of animal scraps, he didn't see waste, he saw opportunity. The connection between glue and gelatin might seem weird to us now, but they're basically cousins. Both come from collagen. Both involve boiling animal parts. The main difference is that one sticks things together and the other, well, wiggles. Cooper's factory was already processing tons of animal hides and bones for glue. The infrastructure was there. The raw materials were there. Why not make something people could eat? His patent, filed in 1845, described a method for making portable gelatin. Basically, he figured out how to extract gelatin, purify it, and then dry it into sheets that could be stored indefinitely. Just add hot water and boom, you had gelatin. No more 3-day bone-boiling marathons. No more teams of servants. Democracy had come for the wobble. Except it hadn't. Not really. Not yet. Cooper's invention was revolutionary from a technical standpoint, but from a culinary perspective, it was about as appetizing as eating reconstituted glue, which, honestly, wasn't that far from what it was. The sheets were clear, flavorless, and had an unfortunate tendency to taste slightly of the animal they came from. Nobody really wanted their dessert to have subtle notes of cow. He tried marketing it, sort of. But Peter Cooper was an inventor and industrialist, not a food marketer. His advertisements, if you can call them that, read like technical manuals. Portable gelatin, suitable for domestic purposes, prepared via proprietary extraction methods. Not exactly mouth-watering copy. I'd probably pass on that too if I saw it on a shelf. The product languished for decades. Some housewives bought it, mostly those who'd read about it in domestic science magazines, which were just becoming a thing. These early adopters would dissolve Cooper sheets in hot water, add their own sugar and flavoring, maybe some fruit if they were feeling fancy. It worked, technically, but it was still a far cry from convenient. The real problem was that Cooper had solved only half the equation. He'd made gelatin easier to store and transport, but not easier to use. You still needed to know what to do with it, how much sugar to add, what flavors worked, how long to let it set. It was like selling someone flour and expecting them to figure out bread on their own. Meanwhile, 50 years were passing. Cooper went on to found Cooper Union, the famous engineering college in New York. He ran for president. He invented other things. His gelatin patent gathered dust, literally and figuratively. Most people forgot he'd even invented it. But in 1897, in Leroy, New York, a cough syrup manufacturer named Pearl Bixby Waite was having his own problems. The cough syrup business was brutal. Competition was fierce. Everyone and their grandmother was selling some kind of patent medicine, usually with impressive amounts of alcohol or opium, which probably explains why they worked so well. Waite, and yes, that was really his name. Pearl with an E was what you might charitably call a serial entrepreneur, or less charitably, someone who couldn't stick with anything. He'd tried his hand at various businesses. None had really taken off. The cough syrup venture was just the latest in a string of moderate failures. His wife, May, was the one who suggested branching out into food products. The story goes that she was experimenting in their kitchen, trying to make something that might sell better than cough syrup, which, let's face it, was a pretty low bar. She'd gotten hold of some gelatin, probably Cooper's or a similar product, and was playing around with it. Now here's where the historical record gets a bit fuzzy. Some accounts say Pearl came up with the flavoring, others credit May entirely. Still others suggest it was a collaborative effort. What we know for certain is that between the two of them, they figured out the magic formula. Pre-packaged gelatin with the sugar and flavoring already mixed in. The flavors were simple: strawberry, raspberry, orange, and lemon. The same artificial fruit essences they'd been using in their cough syrups, which suddenly makes a lot more sense. They weren't inventing new flavors. They were repurposing their existing inventory. Waste not, want not. But the real genius, the stroke of marketing brilliance, was the name. Jell-O. May supposedly came up with it, combining gel from gelatin with the popular O suffix that was trendy in product names at the time. It was short, catchy, fun to say. Everything that portable gelatin suitable for domestic purposes wasn't. They packaged it in small cardboard boxes, designed the now famous cursive logo, though it looked quite different from today's version, and started trying to sell it door to door around Leroy. This was 1897, the same year the Boston subway opened. Bram Stoker published Dracula, and Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. The world was changing fast, but not fast enough for Jell-O. The Waite's sales strategy was, well, there wasn't really a strategy. Pearl would load up his horse and buggy with boxes, ride around town, knock on doors, try to explain to skeptical housewives why they needed flavored gelatin powder. Most weren't interested. The psychology makes sense when you think about it. Here's this cough syrup salesman showing up at your door, trying to sell you colored powder that supposedly turns into dessert. In an era before FDA regulations, before consumer protection laws, before you could Google whether something was legitimate, would you buy it? Probably not. The Waits tried everything they could think of. They gave out free samples. They did demonstrations at local fairs. They even tried to get local grocers to stock it. But grocers didn't want it either. It was too new, too strange, too risky. Shelf space was precious. Why waste it on something nobody understood? For 2 years, Pearl and May struggled. They were making Jell-O in their kitchen, storing boxes in their barn, watching them slowly expire. The few sales they made barely covered the cost of ingredients, let alone their time. It was becoming clear that Jell-O, despite its catchy name and convenient formula, was heading the same way as Pearl's previous ventures. The frustration must have been immense. They'd solved a real problem, made something genuinely useful, but nobody wanted it. It's the classic inventor's dilemma. Being right doesn't matter if you can't convince anyone else. By 1899, Pearl Waite was done. He couldn't afford to keep making Jell-O, couldn't afford to keep trying to sell it, couldn't afford to keep believing in it. He needed out. He needed cash. He needed to move on to the next thing, hopefully something that would actually sell. Enter orator Francis Woodward, Waite's neighbor, owner of the Genesee Pure Food Company, and someone who understood something the Waites didn't, that sometimes the product isn't the problem, sometimes it's the pitch. The negotiations must have been interesting. Here's Waite, desperate to unload this failed venture. And here's Woodward, successful businessman, seeing what exactly? We don't know what made him interested. Maybe he saw potential. Maybe he felt sorry for his neighbor. Maybe he just had $450 to spare. That was the price, $450. In today's money, that's about $15,000. Not nothing, but not exactly a fortune either. For that price, Woodward got the name, the formula, the existing inventory, and all rights to what would become one of the most valuable food brands in American history. Some historians have called this the worst business deal in American history, worse than the Dutch buying Manhattan, worse than Blockbuster passing on Netflix. But that's hindsight talking. In 1899, Pearl Waite got exactly what he wanted, out. He went back to the cough syrup business, later became a successful carpenter, lived a comfortable life. never expressed any public regret about selling Jell-O. Though you have to wonder, late at night, when he saw Jell-O advertisements everywhere, did he think about what might have been? The patent medicine connection is particularly ironic when you consider where Jell-O would eventually end up. From medicine to food to cultural icon, the same dubious health claims that characterized the patent medicine era would eventually be used to sell Jell-O too. Good for invalids, easily digested, pure and wholesome. But all that was still to come. In 1899, orator Francis Woodward had just bought a failed dessert powder for $450. His employees thought he was crazy. His wife thought he was crazy. There's evidence that even Woodward himself thought he might be crazy. Little did any of them know the real transformation was about to begin, because Woodward understood something fundamental about American consumers. They didn't need a new product. They needed someone to teach them why they wanted it. You can picture orator Francis Woodward in his office at the Genesee Pure Food Company. The year is 1899. And he's staring at boxes of Jell-O, wondering what exactly he's just done. For $150 might not sound like much now, but for a small food company in Leroy, New York, it was a significant investment, especially for a product that had already failed. Woodward wasn't new to the food business. His Genesee Pure Food Company was doing reasonably well with products like a roasted cereal coffee substitute called Grano, which tells you something about the food trends of the era. People were really into adding O to everything and apparently willing to drink fake coffee made from grain. Different times. But Jell-O was different from Grano. Grano was replacing something people already used every day, coffee. Jell-O wasn't replacing anything. It was creating a need that didn't exist yet, trying to convince people they wanted wobbly desserts when most Americans had never even seen one. The first few months were brutal. Woodward tried the same strategies that had worked for his other products. Put ads in local newspapers, sent samples to grocers, waited for orders to roll in. They didn't. The same resistance that had defeated Pearl Weight was now defeating Woodward. According to company records that survived, and we should note that much of Jell-O's early documentation was lost in various fires and corporate transitions. Woodward's initial sales were barely better than Waite's had been. He was moving maybe a few dozen boxes a month, mostly to curious housewives who'd tried it at church socials or county fairs. The turning point, or what Woodward thought would be the turning point, came when he decided to reformulate slightly. He added more sugar, intensified the fruit flavors, made the colors brighter. The original Weight formula had been subtle, probably because they were used to medicine which wasn't supposed to taste too good. Woodward went the opposite direction. If it was going to be dessert, it should taste like dessert. He also redesigned the packaging, made the boxes more colorful, more appealing, added little recipe suggestions on the side. Simple things like add sliced bananas or perfect for invalids. That last one seems weird now, but the Victorian obsession with invalid food was real. Anything easy to digest was marketed to the sick. But Even with these improvements, Jell-O was hemorrhaging money. The production costs, the advertising, the free samples, it was all adding up, and the sales weren't keeping pace. Woodward was basically funding a very expensive chemistry experiment that produced wiggling fruit-flavored failures. The story goes, and this is one of those tales that might be corporate mythology, but gets repeated in every history of Jell-O, that one particularly bad day in 1900. Woodward offered to sell the whole Jell-O business to his plant superintendent, Andrew Samuel Nico, for $35. $35. Less than 10% of what he'd paid Waite just a year earlier. Nico supposedly thought about it, went home, discussed it with his wife, and came back the next day saying no thanks. He didn't see any future in flavored gelatin either. Imagine being the guy who turned down Jell-O for $35. That's got to sting more than passing on Apple stock. Whether that specific story is true or embellished, what we know for certain is that Woodward was desperate by late 1900. He'd tried everything he could think of, and nothing was working. Jell-O was becoming an embarrassment. The other businessmen in Leroy were starting to whisper. Poor orator, usually so smart, completely fooled by that Waite fellow. But here's where Woodward's business acumen finally kicked in. Instead of giving up, he decided to completely reimagine how food was sold. If people wouldn't come to Jell-O, he'd take Jell-O to them, but not the way Waite had done it, not personally, not desperately, but with style, with sophistication, with what we'd now call brand building. The plan he hatched in early 1901 was audacious for its time. He would hire a team of well-dressed, well-spoken salesmen. He'd give them fancy horse-drawn carriages, not farm wagons, actual carriages with the Jell-O name painted on the side. He'd dress them in suits and ties, make them look like successful businessmen, not traveling peddlers. These weren't going to be door-to-door beggars. These were going to be Jell-O representatives, bringing modern convenience to American housewives. The psychological shift was brilliant. By making his salesmen look prosperous, he made Jell-O look prosperous. By making them look professional, he made Jell-O look professional. It wasn't some sketchy powder sold by questionable characters. It was a premium product delivered by gentlemen. The salesmen were carefully trained. Woodward wrote scripts for them, taught them how to demonstrate the product, how to handle objections, how to leave gracefully if someone wasn't interested. This was revolutionary. Nobody was training food salesmen like this. Food was sold by grocers, not performed by actors. But the real genius, the thing that would change everything, was what these salesmen carried with them. Not just Jell-O, but recipe books. Thousands and thousands of recipe books. Pretty little booklets with colored illustrations showing elaborate Jell-O desserts that looked like they belonged in those aristocratic European dining rooms. The recipes were aspirational. They showed molded Jell-O in fancy shapes, layered Jell-O parfaits, Jell-O with suspended fruits arranged in patterns. These weren't just desserts, they were edible art projects. And the message was clear. You too could make something this beautiful, this sophisticated, this modern. The salesman would arrive at a house, knock politely, introduce themselves as representatives of the Genesee Pure Food Company. They'd offer the housewife a free recipe book, no obligation, just a gift, a collection of delightful new dessert ideas. Oh, and by the way, these recipes all use this remarkable new product called Jell-O, which happened to be available at your local grocer. The genius was that they weren't selling Jell-O. They were selling the idea of Jell-O, the possibility of Jell-O, the dream of serving something that would make your guests gasp with delight. The recipe books were expensively produced, full color at a time when most print was black and white, thick paper, quality binding. They looked like something you'd keep, something you'd show your friends, something that made you feel sophisticated just owning it. Historical estimates suggest, though exact numbers are hard to verify, that Woodward distributed over 15 million recipe books in the first few years. 15 million. In a country with only about 20 million households. That's market saturation before market saturation was even a concept. The transformation was almost immediate. Orders started coming in. First a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. Grocers who had refused to stock Jell-O were now begging for shipments. Their customers were coming in with these recipe books, asking for Jell-O by name, demanding it. By the end of 1902, just 2 years after Woodward almost sold the company for $35, Jell-O's sales had reached $250,000. That's about $8 million in today's dollars. From near death to profit in 24 months. The salesmen became local celebrities. Their arrival in a town was an event. Children would chase the carriages. Housewives would gather to see the demonstrations. Local newspapers would write about the Jell-O men visiting town. It was marketing as entertainment, decades before anyone would coin that term. Some food historians argue this was the birth of modern food marketing. The idea that you don't sell the product, you sell the lifestyle. You don't sell gelatin powder, you sell the image of a successful hostess serving beautiful desserts. You don't sell convenience, you sell aspiration wrapped in convenience. The competition took notice. Suddenly everyone was trying to make their own gelatin desserts. Knox Gelatin tried to compete with unflavored gelatin and their own recipe books, but they'd missed the point. Jell-O wasn't selling gelatin, it was selling Jell-O, the brand, the experience, the promise. There's something beautifully American about the whole thing. A failed product, rescued by marketing, transformed into success not by making it better, but by making people believe it was better, by teaching them to want something they'd never wanted before. Woodward had cracked the code, but he was just getting started. The recipe books were only phase 1. Phase 2 would involve something even more audacious. He was going to make Jell-O famous, literally, by associating it with the most famous faces in America. But first, he had to make sure every single household in America had one of those recipe books. And then another one, and another, because the more recipes people had, the more Jell-O they'd need to buy. The wobble was about to become unstoppable. You're watching a Jell-O salesman prepare for his route in 1903. His carriage gleams in the morning sun, painted in deep green with gold lettering spelling out Jell-O in that distinctive cursive script. He's checking his inventory, not of product, but of recipe books, stacks and stacks of them, each one a tiny missionary for the gospel of wobbling desserts. The recipe books themselves were works of art, illustrated by professional artists, including Rose O'Neill, who would later create the Cupid doll. The covers featured elaborate Jell-O molds that looked like stained glass windows, translucent and glowing, impossibly beautiful. The kind of thing that made housewives stop and stare. Inside, the recipes started simple. Plain Jell-O dessert. Dissolve 1 package in hot water. Add cold water. Chill until firm. But then they got progressively more elaborate. Roman punch, Macedon of fruits, Spanish cream. Names designed to sound exotic, worldly, sophisticated. The instructions were written in a tone that assumed success. Your guests will marvel. Children will beg for more. The perfect conclusion to any meal. This wasn't just a recipe book, it was a confidence builder, a promise that you too could be the kind of hostess who served desserts with French names. But here's what made Woodward's strategy particularly brilliant. The books were numbered, collectible. Each year brought new editions with new recipes, new illustrations, new reasons to keep collecting. Housewives would actually request specific books they were missing, like they were building a library. The salesmen were trained to create events around their visits. They'd partner with local grocers, announce their arrival in advance, sometimes even coordinate with women's clubs and church groups. The Jell-O demonstration will be held at Morrison's Grocery this Saturday at 2 p.m. It sounds quaint now, but this was entertainment in small-town America. You can imagine the scene. 20 or 30 housewives gathered in a grocery store, watching a well-dressed man demonstrate how to unmold a perfect Jell-O dessert. The gasp when it slides out intact, jewel-like and trembling. The samples passed around on small plates. The recipe books distributed like party favors. The salesman had responses for every objection. Too expensive? Actually, madam, 1 package serves 6 and costs less than a pound of butter. Too complicated? Why, Mrs. Henderson down the street made 3 different varieties just last week. Not sure your family would like it? Here's a sample package absolutely free. Just promise you'll try it. That free sample strategy was revolutionary and expensive. Woodward was literally giving away thousands of dollars worth of product. His board of directors thought he'd lost his mind, but he understood something they didn't. The first taste was free, but the second would cost you. And once people tried it, especially children, they were hooked. The children angle was particularly clever. The salesmen were instructed to always mention how much children loved Jell-O, how it was wholesome and pure, how it was really more of a health food than a dessert. Mothers who might resist buying treats for themselves couldn't resist buying something good for their children. The recipe book started including sections specifically for children. Nursery desserts, with simple Jell-O treats that mothers could make for their little ones. The illustrations showed rosy-cheeked children eagerly eating Jell-O, looking healthy and happy. The message was clear. Good mothers served Jell-O. But Woodward's real masterstroke was something that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. He started advertising in women's magazines. Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, full-page, full-color advertisements that were basically recipe book pages writ large. The ads didn't just sell Jell-O, they sold a lifestyle. They showed elegant dinner parties, beautiful table settings, sophisticated hostesses serving magnificent Jell-O creations. And always, there was a small coupon at the bottom. Send for our free recipe book. The numbers were staggering. By 1904, Jell-O was spending $250,000 a year on advertising, the same amount they'd sold in all of 1902. It was an unheard of advertising budget for a food product. Most food companies relied on word of mouth and grocer recommendations. Woodward was building a brand. The magazine ads reached women that the salesman couldn't. Urban women, wealthy women, women who would never attend a grocery store demonstration, but who would absolutely clip a coupon from Ladies' Home Journal. The recipe books sent to these women were even fancier, sometimes hardbound, suitable for display on a bookshelf. The salesmen, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their approach. They carried elaborate sample cases, like jewelry salesmen, with different Jell-O flavors displayed under glass. They had special molds they'd bring to demonstrations, copperfish, elaborate flowers, even miniature buildings. Things that made Jell-O look less like food and more like art. Training manuals from the era, preserved in the Jell-O Museum in Leroy, reveal just how detailed the sales process had become. Salesmen were taught to notice details about a household. Children's toys in the yard meant emphasize the wholesome angle. Fine curtains in the windows meant emphasize the sophistication angle. Multiple milk bottles on the porch meant this family could afford convenience foods. The territory system was carefully managed. Each salesman had exclusive rights to certain towns, certain routes. They were expected to visit every household at least twice a year, build relationships, remember names. How did little Tommy enjoy the cherry Jell-O, Mrs. Watson? This was relationship selling before anyone called it that. The cultural impact was starting to show. Church cookbooks began including Jell-O recipes. County fairs added Jell-O mold competitions. The word Jell-O was entering the vocabulary not just as a product name, but as a generic term for any gelatin dessert, much to the horror of Woodward's lawyers who fought constantly to protect the trademark. Immigration was booming in these years. Ellis Island was processing thousands of new Americans daily, and Jell-O positioned itself as an American food, something immigrants could make to show they were assimilating. The recipe book started including American versions of ethnic desserts. Italian Jell-O ice, German Jell-O cake, Irish Jell-O cream. There's something almost anthropological about tracking Jell-O's spread through these recipe books. You can see American food culture being invented in real time. The idea that dessert should be easy, that it should be colorful, that it should be fun. These weren't traditional American values. They were being created by Jell-O's marketing department. By 1905, Jell-O's sales hit $1 million. The 15 million recipe books distributed had done their job. The fancy carriages had become a familiar sight in every town. The salesmen had become trusted advisors on all matters of home entertainment. One food historian called it the first viral marketing campaign, though nobody would have understood that term at the time. The infrastructure Woodward built was remarkable. Distribution centers in major cities. A fleet of carriages that would make any logistics company proud. A sales force trained better than most corporations' executives. All for flavored gelatin powder. It was either insane or genius, possibly both. But even as the salesmen were conquering America town by town, Woodward was already thinking bigger. He'd proven that marketing could sell Jell-O. Now he wanted to prove that fame could sell it even better. The age of celebrity endorsement was about to begin, and Jell-O would lead the charge. The salesmen would keep traveling, keep distributing recipe books, keep doing demonstrations. But soon they'd be joined by something even more powerful. The faces and voices of America's biggest stars, all testifying to the wonders of wobbling dessert. The entire country was about to learn what Jell-O spelled. You're standing in a tenement kitchen on New York's Lower East Side. It's 1906. And Mrs. Antonella Rossini is reading a Jell-O recipe book that her neighbor just gave her. She's been in America for 3 years. Her English is still uncertain, but the pictures in this little book are speaking a universal language, colorful, shimmering desserts that look like jewels. The immigration wave of the early 1900s was unprecedented. Between 1900 and 1910, nearly 9 million immigrants arrived in America. Italians, Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, Germans, Scandinavians. Each group bringing their own food traditions, their own desserts, their own ideas about what belonged on a dinner table. For these new Americans, Jell-O represented something peculiar but powerful. It was undeniably American. You couldn't get it in the old country, but it was also a blank canvas. You could add your own fruits, your own flavors, make it yours while still making something American. Mrs. Rossini is looking at a recipe for fruit Jell-O. She doesn't have the canned peaches it calls for, but she has preserved figs from her sister in Italy. Why not? The beauty of Jell-O was its adaptability. It didn't care what fruit you suspended in it. It would hold anything. Evidence suggests that immigrant communities adopted Jell-O in fascinating ways, though specific documentation is limited since many of these adaptations happened in home kitchens that left no records. What we do know from settlement house reports and social worker observations is that Jell-O appeared at immigrant gatherings with increasing frequency. The settlement houses, Those progressive era institutions designed to help immigrants assimilate actively promoted Jell-O as part of their Americanization programs. They held cooking classes where immigrant women learned to make American foods, and Jell-O was always on the curriculum. Easy to make, impossible to ruin, visually impressive. It was the perfect teaching tool. Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, according to their archived records, went through cases of Jell-O for their cooking demonstrations. The social workers saw it as a bridge food, something that wasn't threatening or completely foreign, but was distinctly American. A way to ease into American food culture without abandoning everything familiar. You can picture the scene in these cooking classes. Italian women next to Polish women next to Irish women, all watching a social worker demonstrate how to dissolve the powder, add water, chill until firm. The language barriers didn't matter. The process was visual, simple, universal. But what happened next was more interesting than the social workers probably realized. These women took Jell-O home and made it their own. The Irish added whiskey, not enough to prevent setting, but enough to taste. The Italians suspended pieces of biscotti. The Eastern European Jews discovered it was kosher if you were careful about the flavors, and started using it for holiday meals. The company noticed this trend, though it's unclear whether they fully understood it at first. The recipe book started including what they called continental desserts, which were basically regular Jell-O recipes with vaguely European names. Bavarian cream, Nesselrode pudding, Charlotte russe. Most of these had nothing to do with their supposed origins, but they sounded fancy and international. Jewish immigrants particularly embraced Jell-O. It was pareve, meaning it contained neither meat nor dairy, at least in its basic form. This made it perfect for keeping kosher. You could serve it after a meat meal when dairy desserts were forbidden. Orthodox Jewish cookbooks from the 1910s show numerous Jell-O recipes, often with wine or fruit juice replacing some of the water. The Italian immigrants in places like Brooklyn and Boston started adding Jell-O to their feast day celebrations. St. Joseph's Day tables might feature elaborate Jell-O molds shaped like crosses or flowers, tinted in the colors of the Italian flag. It was a way of being both Italian and American simultaneously. Some historians argue that Jell-O succeeded with immigrants precisely because it had no strong ethnic identity of its own. Unlike apple pie or pumpkin pie, which were aggressively Anglo-American, Jell-O was ethnically neutral. It could become whatever you wanted it to become. The children of immigrants were especially important to Jell-O's spread. They encountered it at school, at friends' houses, at church socials, and they brought the desire for it home. Mama, can we make the wiggling dessert like Mrs. O'Brien serves? Parents who might have been suspicious of American foods couldn't resist their children's requests. These children were straddling two worlds, speaking their parents' language at home. English at school, eating old country food for dinner, American food for lunch. Jell-O became part of their bicultural identity, something that belonged to both worlds and neither. The phenomenon wasn't limited to East Coast cities. In the Midwest, German immigrants were incorporating Jell-O into their traditional cooking, adding it to their elaborate Christmas cookies displays. In California, Chinese immigrants were experimenting with adding lychees and other Asian fruits, though documentation of these early experiments is frustratingly sparse. What's particularly interesting, and this is something food historians still debate, is whether Jell-O helped accelerate assimilation or whether it provided a safe way to maintain difference. Was making Jell-O with Italian figs becoming more American or staying more Italian? Probably both. The Genesee Pure Food Company seemed content to let these variations flourish. They didn't try to control how people used Jell-O, didn't insist on authentic recipes. This flexibility was probably accidental, but it turned out to be marketing genius. Every immigrant group could claim Jell-O as their own. By 1908, Jell-O was advertising in foreign language newspapers. Der Staatsanzeiger, Il Progresso Italo-Americano, the Jewish Daily Forward. The ads were translated, but the product name stayed the same. Jell-O transcended language. Everyone knew what that wiggle meant. The recipe books started appearing in simplified English, with more pictures, fewer words, designed for people still learning the language. The instructions became almost wordless, just numbered pictures showing the steps. Pour, stir, chill, enjoy. Democracy through dessert. There's a photograph from 1909, preserved in the Ellis Island archives, showing a church potluck in Manhattan's Little Italy. Among the plates of pasta and bread, there's a magnificent Jell-O mold, green and shimmering, shaped like a star. It's impossible to know who made it or what they put in it, but there it is, proof that Jell-O had crossed the cultural divide. The salesmen were instructed to pay special attention to immigrant neighborhoods. They were told to be patient, speak slowly, leave extra recipe books. Some of the more enterprising salesmen learned basic phrases in multiple languages. Delicious. Easy. Children love it. The universal sales pitch. But there was also resistance. Some immigrant communities saw Jell-O as a symbol of everything wrong with America. Too artificial, too processed, too far from real food. These critics weren't entirely wrong. Jell-O was pretty far from the farm-to-table ethos of old country cooking. The tension between tradition and assimilation played out in countless kitchens. Grandmothers who insisted on making traditional desserts from scratch, mothers caught between old and new, children who just wanted what their American friends were eating. Jell-O became part of the larger negotiation of American identity. By 1910, it was clear that Jell-O had become part of the immigrant American experience. Not universally loved, not completely accepted, but present, wiggling its way into the complicated story of becoming American. Like jazz or baseball, it was something uniquely American that somehow belonged to everyone. The irony was delicious, if you think about it. A dessert that had once been the exclusive province of European aristocracy had become the democratic treat of American immigrants. The very people who would have been servants in the old country were now making elaborate molded desserts in their tenement kitchens. Mrs. Rossini did make that fig Jell-O, according to her granddaughter, who recorded the family story decades later. It became a family tradition, served every Christmas alongside the traditional Italian cookies. Half old world, half new, wholly American. The perfect metaphor for the immigrant experience, suspended between two cultures, holding its shape, trembling but not breaking. You're listening to the radio in 1922, and suddenly Jack Benny's voice fills your living room. Jell-O again. That cheerful greeting would become one of the most famous catchphrases in American entertainment, repeated every week to millions of listeners, making both Benny and Jell-O household names. The decision to sponsor radio shows was revolutionary for its time. Radio was still new, experimental, not entirely respectable. Many established companies thought advertising on radio was undignified, like shouting your product name in the street. But Jell-O understood something others didn't. Radio wasn't just advertising, it was intimacy. These voices were inside people's homes, part of their evening routines, trusted friends. Jack Benny wasn't even the first. Before him came Ernestine Schumann-Heink, one of the world's most famous opera singers. The Metropolitan Opera star would talk about Jell-O between arias, her thick German accent lending unexpected gravitas to discussions of wobbling dessert. The children, they loved the Jell-O. It was surreal, and it worked. The pairing seems bizarre now. Opera and Jell-O. High culture and convenience food. But that was precisely the point. Jell-O was still fighting its image as common, cheap, ordinary. Having Schumann-Heink endorse it was like having royalty bless your product. If it was good enough for someone who had sung for the Kaiser, it was good enough for your dinner table. But Jack Benny changed everything. His show didn't just advertise Jell-O. It made Jell-O part of the entertainment. Characters would work the product into storylines, make jokes about it, sing songs about it. The famous Jell-O song, Jell-O, became something children across America could sing. They'd spell it out at the dinner table, driving their parents to distraction and to the grocery store. The numbers were staggering. Within 2 years of sponsoring Benny's show, Jell-O's sales doubled, then doubled again. The show was reaching 20 million listeners every week. 20 million people hearing about Jell-O, laughing about Jell-O, thinking about Jell-O. That's market penetration that modern marketers would kill for. You have to understand what radio meant in the 1920s. It was the internet, television, and social media all rolled into one. Families would gather around the radio like a fireplace, planning their evenings around their favorite shows. And Sunday night meant Jack Benny, which meant Jell-O. The association became automatic. The advertising wasn't subtle. Benny would stop mid-joke to extol Jell-O-esque virtues. But somehow it didn't feel intrusive. He made it part of his persona, the slightly cheap, slightly vain character who genuinely loved his sponsor's product. When he said Jell-O was delicious, you believed him or at least you wanted to. Meanwhile, the visual advertising was getting equally sophisticated. Norman Rockwell was creating illustrations for Jell-O ads, though the extent of his involvement is debated by art historians. Some images attributed to him may have been by imitators trading on his style. What's certain is that Jell-O ads were appearing in the Saturday Evening Post looking like Rockwell paintings, wholesome American families enjoying wholesome American dessert. The recipe books had evolved too. They weren't just recipe collections anymore. They were lifestyle magazines. Fashion tips, entertaining advice, table-setting suggestions, all built around the assumption that Jell-O would be part of your social life. The 1923 edition included a section on Jell-O for the bridge party because apparently that was a thing. Celebrity endorsements expanded beyond radio. Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, appeared in Jell-O ads. Her testimonial read like poetry. In my household, Jell-O is more than dessert. It's happiness itself. Whether she actually ate Jell-O or just cashed the check, we'll never know, but her face sold millions of boxes. Child actors were particularly effective. The Campbell kids, those chubby-cheeked illustrations that sold soup, also sold Jell-O. Baby Peggy, one of the first child stars, was photographed eating Jell-O with obvious delight, or at least professional enthusiasm. The message was clear. Children love Jell-O. Good parents provide it. The scientific angle was pushed hard too. Ads featured doctors, or at least men in white coats who looked like doctors, explaining why Jell-O was wholesome and pure. They used terms like pre-digested protein and easily assimilated nourishment. It sounded impressive, meant nothing, sold everything. Schools were getting involved. Home economics classes taught Jell-O preparation as part of scientific cooking. The company provided free educational materials, charts showing the food value of Jell-O, posters demonstrating proper preparation techniques. They were training a generation of future consumers. The cultural saturation was remarkable. Jell-O jokes appeared in vaudeville routines. Jell-O references showed up in popular songs. The phrase "nervous as Jell-O" entered the vernacular, though what that meant exactly, nobody was quite sure. You couldn't escape it. It had achieved something beyond brand recognition. It had become part of the cultural furniture. But not everyone was celebrating. Some cultural critics saw Jell-O's omnipresence as a symptom of American superficiality. All surface, no substance, literally and figuratively. These intellectuals wrote essays about how Jell-O represented the commodification of joy, the artificial replacing the authentic. They weren't entirely wrong, but nobody was listening. They were too busy making Jell-O salads. The company's response to criticism was genius. They didn't fight it. They embraced it. Yes, Jell-O was modern. Yes, it was convenient. Yes, it was artificial. That was the point. This was the 20th century. The future had arrived, and it wiggled. Regional variations were becoming more pronounced. Southern hostesses were adding mayonnaise, creating something called congealed salads that would horrify anyone north of the Mason-Dixon line. Midwesterners were suspending vegetables, creating perfection salads that were neither perfect nor salad. California was going crazy with citrus. Every region claiming their Jell-O creations were the correct ones. The class dynamics were shifting too. What had once been an aspirational product for working-class families was becoming slightly class for the upper classes. Serving Jell-O at a society dinner was starting to seem common. But serving an elaborate Jell-O creation at a middle-class dinner party, that was still the height of sophistication. Some food historians mark this period, the mid-1920s, as peak Jell-O, the moment when it achieved maximum cultural penetration without yet becoming a joke, when it was both modern and traditional, both special and everyday, both food and entertainment. It occupied a unique space in American culture that no other food product had achieved. The advertising budget by 1925 exceeded $2 million. In today's money, that's over $30 million. For gelatin, for wobbling flavored gelatin, the return on investment was astronomical. Every dollar spent on advertising returned 10 in sales. Economics professors used it as a case study. How do you create demand for something nobody needs? You make them believe they need it. Church cookbooks from the era show Jell-O in everything. Jell-O at baptism celebrations. Jell-O at funeral luncheons. Jell-O at every potluck in between. It had achieved a kind of ceremonial status. You couldn't have a proper social gathering without it. It wasn't just food anymore, it was ritual. The international expansion was beginning too. Jell-O was being exported to Canada, to Mexico, to Cuba. American businessmen abroad were requesting shipments, homesick for that familiar wobble. The sun never set on the Jell-O empire, though it did tend to melt in tropical climates. But even as Jell-O conquered the world, storm clouds were gathering. The stock market was soaring, credit was easy, everyone was buying everything, including unprecedented amounts of Jell-O. The party couldn't last forever, and when it ended, when the music stopped, when the Great Depression hit, Jell-O would have to transform once again. For now though, in the roaring 20s, Jell-O reigned supreme. It had celebrity endorsements, radio shows, magazine spreads, cultural cachet, everything a brand could want. Jack Benny would sign off each week with Jell-O everyone. And everyone would smile, comfortable in the knowledge that tomorrow's dessert was already in their pantry, colorful, convenient, quintessentially American. The wobble had one, or so it seemed. You're standing in a bread line in Detroit. It's 1932. And the woman in front of you is clutching a small box of Jell-O like it's made of gold. She's been saving it for her daughter's birthday. One of the last luxuries she can afford, though at 5 cents a box. Luxury might be too strong a word. The Great Depression changed everything about how Americans ate. Banks failed, jobs vanished, families who'd been comfortable suddenly found themselves choosing between rent and food. And in this new reality of scarcity and fear, Jell-O had to reinvent itself once again, not as a symbol of modern prosperity, but as a survival tool. The transformation was remarkable. What had been marketed as an elegant dessert for bridge parties became the food that stretches. One box could feed 6 people. Add some leftover fruit, even bruised fruit from the discount pile, and you had dessert for a week. The marketing shifted from aspiration to desperation, though they tried to make it sound cheerful. Recipe books from the early 1930s tell the story. Gone were the elaborate molded creations requiring expensive ingredients. In their place came economy desserts and thrifty treats. Recipes that required nothing but Jell-O and water, maybe some saved sugar if you had it. The illustrations still showed happy families, but now they looked grateful rather than glamorous. The company dropped its price, 5 cents a box, down from 10. It was selling at a loss, but they understood something crucial. If Jell-O disappeared from tables during the Depression, it might never come back. Better to lose money now than lose customers forever. You see mothers in grocery stores doing the math. 5 cents for Jell-O could feed 6. A nickel's worth of milk barely filled 2 glasses. The economics were undeniable, even if the nutrition was questionable. But nutrition was a luxury concern. Filling bellies was what mattered. The mock recipes that emerged during this period were ingeniously desperate. Mock apple pie made with Jell-O and crackers. Mock ice cream from whipped Jell-O and evaporated milk. Mock fruit salad using Jell-O instead of actual fruit. The word mock appeared so often in Depression-era cookbooks it became almost poetic. Everything was pretending to be something better. Churches and charitable organizations bought Jell-O by the case. It was one of the cheapest ways to provide something sweet, something that felt special, to people who had nothing. Soup kitchens would serve it as their only dessert, wobbly proof that things weren't completely hopeless. The psychological importance of Jell-O during the Depression is something historians are only now beginning to understand. It wasn't about nutrition, it was about normalcy. Being able to serve dessert, even Jell-O dessert, meant you were still maintaining standards, still providing for your family, still civilized. Eleanor Roosevelt served Jell-O at the White House, part of her campaign to show solidarity with struggling Americans. The menu from a 1933 state dinner includes jellied fruit salad, foreign diplomats politely eating wobbling squares while discussing international finance. The symbolism wasn't subtle. America was tightening its belt, even at the top. The recipe exchanges that developed were touching. Women would trade Jell-O recipes like currency, writing them on backs of envelopes, margins of newspapers, anything to avoid buying new recipe books. These handwritten recipes, preserved in historical societies across the country, show incredible creativity born from limitation. Depression cake became famous or infamous. Made with Jell-O, flour, and whatever else you had. No eggs, no butter, no milk, just hope and gelatin. It didn't taste like much, but it looked like cake. And sometimes looking like cake was enough. The advertising had to walk a delicate line. They couldn't look too prosperous when everyone was suffering, but they couldn't look desperate either. The solution was brilliant. They focused on children. Happy children eating Jell-O. Because even in the worst times, especially in the worst times, parents wanted their children to have something special. The radio shows continued, but the tone changed. Jack Benny made gentle jokes about economizing, about making Jell-O last longer, about adding more water than recommended. The audience laughed because they were doing exactly that. Humor as survival mechanism. Community cookbooks from the era, those spiral-bound collections from churches and women's clubs, show Jell-O in everything. Jell-O vegetable loaves. Jell-O bean salads. Jell-O tuna surprises. The surprise was usually that it was edible. These weren't gourmet creations. They were desperation dressed up as innovation. The Jell-O company quietly provided free product to relief organizations, though they didn't publicize it. Bad form to advertise your charity during a depression. But internal company documents, discovered decades later, show they gave away millions of boxes. Their own small contribution to keeping America fed, or at least desert. Some families developed elaborate Jell-O rituals to maintain dignity. Sunday Jell-O served on the good china, carefully unmolded, presented with ceremony. It might be the only elegant thing on a table of potatoes and cabbage, but it was something. A small rebellion against circumstances. The colors mattered more than ever. In a world gone gray, Jell-O was still red, green, orange, yellow. Artificial colors, sure, but color nonetheless. One woman's diary from 1934 describes making rainbow Jell-O for her children, layering different colors in a glass. They needed to see something beautiful, she wrote. Regional variations became more extreme as people used whatever was locally available. In the South, Jell-O with peanuts, protein and dessert combined. In the Midwest, Jell-O with canned corn, don't ask. On the coasts, Jell-O with seaweed, seriously. Desperation breeds innovation, not always good innovation. The class divisions around Jell-O intensified. For the wealthy who still had money, Jell-O became almost taboo, too associated with poverty. For the middle class hanging on by threads, it was a sign they were still middle class, still serving dessert. For the poor, it was an impossible luxury, unless charity provided. By 1935, as the Depression dragged on, Jell-O had become something unprecedented in American food history. A product that simultaneously represented poverty and prosperity, desperation and hope, making do and maintaining standards. It occupied every rung of the social ladder, meaning something different at each level. The company's sales records from this period are fascinating. Volumes stayed steady or even increased, but revenue plummeted. They were selling more boxes for less money to people who had no money. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it cemented Jell-O's place in American culture forever. There's a photograph from a 1936 church social in Oklahoma. Dust Bowl era. everyone got, clothes mended and remended. But on the table, dozens of Jell-O salads, green ones with suspended vegetables, red ones with fruit cocktail, orange ones with carrots. A feast of color in sepia tone times. The recipes that survived from this era read like poetry of privation. Sunshine salad, when you have nothing but Jell-O and hope. Economy delight, serves 8, costs 10 cents. Mother's special, special because mother made it from nothing. Each recipe a small victory over circumstances. The emotional weight Jell-O carried was enormous. Children who grew up during the Depression would later describe Jell-O as tasting like love, like their mothers trying, like better times that must surely come. These associations would last lifetimes, creating customers whose loyalty went beyond brand preference into emotional necessity. Some social historians argue the Depression saved Jell-O, transformed it from a fad into a staple, from luxury into necessity, from food into symbol. Without the Depression, Jell-O might have remained what it started as, an interesting novelty. Instead, it became part of America's survival story. But even as families scraped and saved and served Jell-O as their only dessert, changes were coming. The New Deal was taking shape. World War II was approaching, and Jell-O would need to transform again. From Depression survivor to wartime patriot, the wobble was nothing if not adaptable. You're standing in a suburban kitchen in 1954, watching Mrs. Betty Anderson unmold her latest creation, a lime Jell-O ring with suspended shrimp, celery, and mayonnaise dollops. She's presenting it at tonight's dinner party like a sculpture, which in a way, it is. This is the atomic age, and even dessert has gone space age. The 1950s transformed Jell-O from Depression survival food into something almost unrecognizable, a medium for culinary experimentation that ranged from inspired to insane. The prosperity that followed World War II meant Americans could afford to play with their food again, and play they did, with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. The savory Jell-O salad phenomenon is one of the most documented and most mocked food trends in American history. But understanding why it happened requires understanding the mindset of 1950s America. Everything was about the future, about progress, about better living through chemistry. If we could split the atom, surely we could suspend a salad. The recipes from this era read like fever dreams. Lime Jell-O with cabbage and marshmallows. Tomato aspic with tuna and hard-boiled eggs. Lemon Jell-O with salmon and cucumber. These weren't created by desperate housewives with nothing else to serve. These were deliberate, planned, proud creations. Better Homes and Gardens ran a feature in 1952 called Salads Men Like, every single one involving Jell-O. The assumption being that masculine appetites required meat or seafood, but modern presentation demanded gelatin. The gender politics of Jell-O could fill a dissertation, and probably has. You watch Mrs. Anderson consulting her recipe collection. She has 3 dedicated Jell-O cookbooks, plus dozens of magazine clippings, recipes shared at church, index cards from neighbors. The competitive aspect of Jell-O salads was fierce. Every suburban hostess had a signature mold, a secret combination that would make guests ask for the recipe. The technology enabled the madness. Refrigerators were bigger, more reliable. Electric mixers could whip Jell-O into foam, creating whole new textures. Tupperware parties taught women about molding and storing. The entire infrastructure of modern convenience aligned to make elaborate Jell-O creations possible. The molds themselves became collectibles. Copper fish, aluminum rings, plastic Christmas trees. Housewives would prowl department stores looking for unique shapes. The right mold could make your reputation. Oh, you must try Helen's Jell-O. She has the most wonderful butterfly mold. Food coloring expanded the palette beyond the standard flavors. You could make any color Jell-O you wanted. Blue for baby showers. Pink for anniversaries. Black for... Actually, nobody made black, but theoretically you could. The artificial rainbow was limited only by imagination and good taste was optional. The advertising embraced the absurdity. Full-page magazine spreads showing Jell-O creations that looked like modern art. Crown Jewel dessert, sunshine salad, rainbow party loaf, each name more optimistic than the last. Each photo more impossibly perfect. Professional food stylists using tricks we'd now consider cheating. Television changed everything. Again, the first Jell-O TV commercials aired in 1951. Suddenly you could see it wiggle in real time. Watch it being made. Observe the perfect unmolding technique. TV cooking shows demonstrated increasingly elaborate preparations. Julia Child might have brought French cooking to America, but local TV brought Jell-O artistry. The corporate recipe development went into overdrive. General Foods, which had bought the Jell-O company in 1925, employed teams of home economists to create new recipes. Test kitchens ran like laboratories, documenting exactly how much mayonnaise you could add before the Jell-O wouldn't set, how many olives you could suspend per cubic inch, the optimal chunk size for ham. Regional variations became extreme. The Midwest embraced the savory salads with particular enthusiasm, creating what some food historians call the Jell-O belt, stretching from Ohio to Iowa. The South preferred their Jell-O sweeter, adding marshmallows and whipped cream to everything. California went crazy with avocados because California. The perfection salad, invented earlier but perfected in the 1950s, became the ultimate expression of controlled chaos. Vegetables arranged in precise patterns, suspended at exact intervals, creating edible geometry. It was cooking as engineering, which appealed to the space-age mindset. Church cookbooks from the 1950s show an explosion of Jell-O recipes. Mrs. Johnson's lime surprise, Betty's best tomato aspic, Reverend's wife's Easter mold. Each recipe carefully attributed, creating micro-celebrities within communities. Your Jell-O salad was your calling card. The class implications shifted again. Now working-class families could afford elaborate Jell-O creations, while upper-class hostesses were returning to simpler fare, or at least claiming to. The democracy of wobble had inverted. What was once exclusive became common. What was once common became kitsch. Men got involved, reluctantly. Company-sponsored contests encouraged bachelor recipes, usually involving beer or pretzels or both. The message was clear. Jell-O wasn't just for ladies anymore, though the resulting creation suggested maybe it should have been. The nutritional claims reached peak absurdity. Advertisements touted Jell-O salads as complete meals containing protein, vegetables, vitamins, everything a growing family needed. The fact that it was mostly sugar and food coloring suspended in animal byproducts was conveniently ignored. This was the age of Tang and TV dinners. Nutrition meant whatever you wanted it to mean.
Some sociologists argue that 1950s Jell-O salads represented controlled anxiety, the Cold War simmering, nuclear annihilation possible, social changes threatening traditional values. But in your kitchen, you could control things. You could suspend
chaos in gelatin, make it beautiful, serve it on your best platter. Everything might be about to explode, but your Jell-O salad would hold its shape. The international perception was bewildered. European visitors to America in the 1950s wrote home about the bizarre American obsession with jellied foods. They put fish in dessert, one French diplomat reportedly wrote, and serve it as salad. The cultural divide was wobbling. Company sales records show this was peak Jell-O financially. Over 300 million boxes sold in 1958 alone. That's more than one box per American per year. The variety had expanded too. New flavors like black cherry and grape. Sugar-free versions for diabetics. Instant Jell-O that set in 30 minutes. Innovation through chemistry. But cracks were starting to show. Younger housewives, the ones who would become the feminists of the 1960s, were beginning to question why they were spending hours creating elaborate molded salads for husbands who barely noticed. The first rumblings of rebellion against domestic perfection, starting in the kitchen, aimed at the Jell-O mold. Food writers were getting sarcastic. James Beard wrote that Jell-O salads were edible evidence of too much time and too little taste. Craig Claiborne called them monuments to misguided creativity. The cultural arbiters were turning. The wobble was becoming wobblier. Still, in 1958, you couldn't attend a potluck, a church social, a family reunion, without encountering multiple Jell-O salads. Green ones, red ones, orange ones, layered ones. Some actually delicious, most politely edible, all proudly presented. It was democracy through dessert, even when it contained seafood. The space race was heating up. Sputnik had launched. America was looking skyward, and Jell-O marketed itself as the food of the future. Astronauts probably wouldn't actually eat lime Jell-O with suspended hot dogs in space, but in 1958, anything seemed possible. The future was bright, colorful, and semi-solid. Mrs. Anderson's shrimp ring is perfectly unmolded now, glistening under the kitchen lights. She carries it to the dining room where her guests wait. They applaud. They always applaud. It's expected. This is performance art, edible theater. The culmination of 50 years of Jell-O evolution, or depending on your perspective, devolution. Tomorrow she'll start planning next week's creation. Something with pineapple and ham perhaps, or strawberry with beets. The possibilities are endless. The future is now, and it wiggles. You're watching the evening news in 1969. Walter Cronkite is talking about Apollo 11. And during the commercial break, there's an ad for Jell-O featuring astronauts, or actors dressed as astronauts, eating wobbling cubes in zero gravity. Except it's not zero gravity. It's wires and camera tricks, but the message is clear. Jell-O is space food, the future, except suddenly it doesn't feel like the future anymore. The 1960s were complicated for Jell-O. On one hand, peak commercial success. The company was selling more than ever, introducing new products like Jell-O 1, 2, 3, which magically separated into 3 layers, technology that seemed almost space age. On the other hand, the culture was shifting, and Jell-O was on the wrong side of the shift. The counterculture didn't trust anything artificial, and Jell-O was profoundly artificial. Hippies were eating brown rice and vegetables, not lime gelatin with suspended marshmallows. The natural food movement was beginning, and there was nothing natural about Jell-O. It was everything the younger generation was rebelling against: processed, corporate, suburban, square. You can track the generational divide through cookbooks. The mothers were still making elaborate Jell-O salads. Their daughters were refusing to eat them, calling them plastic food, chemical cuisine. The dinner table became a battlefield, wobbling with tension. The space program connection was real but complicated. NASA did experiment with gelatin-based foods for astronauts, though whether actual Jell-O brand products were used remains unclear from available records. What's certain is that the company marketed heavily on the space angle, the treat that travels to the stars, even as the stars were becoming less interesting than the protests in the streets. College campuses in the late 1960s treated Jell-O as a symbol of everything wrong with American culture. There are documented cases of Jell-O being used in protests, thrown at administrators, dumped on ROTC buildings. The wobble had become political. One Berkeley student newspaper called Jell-O the edible establishment. Meanwhile, in Middle America, Jell-O consumption continued unabated. The famous green bean casserole with French fried onions, the ambrosia salads with marshmallows and coconut. These weren't going anywhere. The cultural divide wasn't just about politics, it was about food, and Jell-O sat right in the middle of it. The advertising tried to stay relevant. Psychedelic colors in the print ads, rock music in the commercials, groovy recipes for hip, young homemakers. It was painful, like watching your parents try to be cool. The harder they tried, the less cool Jell-O became. Bill Cosby became the spokesperson in 1974, though that's its own complicated story now. At the time, he was America's dad, safe, funny, relatable. His Jell-O commercials with kids became iconic. But even Cosby couldn't make Jell-O seem modern. It was becoming nostalgia food, something your grandmother made. The women's liberation movement had particular contempt for elaborate Jell-O preparations. Betty Friedan didn't specifically mention Jell-O in The Feminine Mystique, but she might as well have. Those hours spent creating perfect molded salads, that was the problem with No Name. The oppression of aspic. Food writers were brutal. MFK Fisher wrote that Jell-O salads were a monument to the American talent for making something from nothing and having it taste like nothing. Food criticism was becoming serious cultural criticism, and Jell-O was an easy target, wobbly, artificial, impossible to defend. The health food stores that started opening in the late 1960s specifically advertised no Jell-O, like it was a selling point. Agar agar, a seaweed-based alternative, was promoted as the natural option. It didn't catch on, but the fact that people were looking for alternatives said everything. Some cultural historians argue this was when Jell-O began its long decline. Not in sales. Those stayed steady, but in cultural relevance. It went from being modern to being mockable, from sophisticated to silly, from the future to the past, all in about a decade. The immigrant communities that had embraced Jell-O in earlier generations were now returning to traditional foods. The ethnic pride movements of the 1960s emphasized authentic cuisine. Jell-O was assimilation food, and assimilation was no longer the goal. Better to serve your grandmother's recipes than your mother's Jell-O molds. Children still loved it. The jiggly texture, the bright colors, the sweet taste. Jell-O remained a pediatric favorite, but it was becoming exclusively children's food. Adults who ate Jell-O were either being ironic or nostalgic, never sincere. The company tried diversifying. Jell-O pudding pups, Jell-O cheesecake mix, Jell-O everything except admitting that the original product was becoming obsolete. Sales remained strong, but the customer base was aging. Young families weren't buying Jell-O. They were buying yogurt, granola, anything that seemed healthy and natural. Regional differences intensified. The Midwest clung to their Jell-O salads with defensive pride. The coasts abandoned them entirely. The South modified but maintained. It became a geographic marker. Tell me your Jell-O consumption, and I'll tell you your zip code. The moon landing in July 1969 should have been Jell-O-esque moment. Space age food for the space age. But the culture had moved on. The future wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about authenticity. And there was nothing authentic about powder that turned into wiggle. High-end restaurants started serving aspic again, but they were careful to distance it from Jell-O. This was classical French technique, not American convenience food. The same thing in a different context, class warfare through gelatin. The environmental movement added another nail. All that packaging, all those artificial ingredients. All that processing. Jell-O was wasteful, unnatural, part of the problem. The Back to the Land movement definitely wasn't bringing Jell-O. By the end of the 1960s, Jell-O occupied a strange position in American culture, still selling millions of boxes, still appearing at every church potluck, still beloved by children, but culturally toxic to anyone under 30 who cared about being cool. It had become what it had never been before, embarrassing. The company's internal documents from this period, made public decades later during various corporate restructurings, show real panic. Focus groups with young consumers were disasters. They saw Jell-O as fake food, mom food, 1950s food, everything they didn't want to be. But here's the thing about American food culture. Nothing really dies. It just goes underground, waits, transforms, comes back as something else. Jell-O was about to enter its ironic phase, its campy phase, its so uncool at school phase. The wobble would return, just differently. The 1970s would bring Jell-O shots to college parties, turning children's dessert into adult intoxication. The 1980s would bring Nouvelle Cuisine's precious little aspects, Jell-O by another name. The 1990s would bring nostalgic revival, Generation X rediscovering their childhood. But in 1969, watching those fake astronauts eat fake space Jell-O, it felt like the end of something. The space-age optimism that had carried Jell-O to its heights was curdling into something else. Vietnam, Watergate, oil crises. The future wasn't what it used to be, and neither was Jell-O. The moon was conquered, but the Jell-O mold was cracking. The wobble that had held America together through depression and war and prosperity was losing its shape, dissolving back into its constituent parts: sugar, collagen, artificial color, artificial flavor, artificial everything. The very things that had once made it modern now made it suspect. You're scrolling through TikTok in 2024, and there it is, a 20-something creating Depression-era Jell-O salad, complete with suspended hot dogs and mayonnaise. The comments are equal parts horror and fascination. Why would anyone eat this? My grandma made this exact thing. I'm trying this for the chaos. 60 million views and counting. Jell-O has gone viral again. The journey from the 1970s to today has been stranger than anyone could have predicted. Jell-O shots became a college staple sometime in the 1980s, though the exact origin is disputed, turning grandmother's dessert into fraternity party fuel. The irony was delicious, or at least intoxicating. Baby boomers horrified that their children were literally drinking their childhood. The 1980s brought the pudding pop era. Bill Cosby's face on every box, selling frozen Jell-O on sticks. That whole story has aged poorly for obvious reasons, but at the time it seemed like successful brand extension. Jell-O was trying to be relevant without changing what it fundamentally was: artificial wobble in new forms. Then came the 1990s nostalgia wave. Generation X rediscovering Jell-O with ironic affection. Suddenly it was cool to serve Jell-O molds at dinner parties, but only if everyone understood you were being ironic. The quotation marks were invisible but essential. Look at us eating Jell-O salad, wink wink. The Mormon connection became more visible during this period. Utah consuming more Jell-O per capita than any other state. Cultural observers struggled to explain it. Large families needing cheap desserts. Prohibition on alcohol and coffee making Jell-O the acceptable vice. Or just regional taste solidified into tradition. The answers varied depending on who you asked. Hospital Jell-O became its own cultural marker. That green cube on the tray, proof you were sick enough to be institutionalized, but well enough to eat. Clear liquids diet always meant Jell-O. It became comfort food through repetition, associated with recovery, with being taken care of, with getting better. The molecular gastronomy movement of the 2000s accidentally rehabilitated gelatin. Suddenly high-end restaurants were serving spherification and fluid gels, basically Jell-O techniques with fancy names and expensive ingredients. Food and Wine magazine ran articles about the new aspic as if it had ever really left. Social media changed everything. Instagram made Jell-O photogenic again. Those rainbow-layered shots, the suspended fruit arranged just so, the perfect wiggle captured in slow motion. It wasn't about taste anymore. It was about visual impact. The algorithm loved color and movement. The pandemic years brought unexpected Jell-O revival. People stuck at home, trying grandmother's recipes, posting results online. Cooking through my family cookbook became a trend, and every family cookbook had Jell-O recipes. The past became present through boredom and nostalgia. TikTok accelerated everything. Young creators discovering Jell-O salads with genuine shock. Rating vintage recipes my followers send me. The worse they looked, the more views they got. Lime Jell-O with seafood became nightmare fuel and entertainment simultaneously. The company has tried to modernize. Sugar-free versions, organic alternatives, collabs with trendy brands. But the core product remains essentially unchanged since Pearl Waite's Kitchen. Powder, water, wobble. The simplicity that made it successful makes it hard to reinvent. Food historians now study Jell-O as a lens for understanding American culture. Academic papers about Jell-O and gender performance in post-war America. The racialized geography of gelatin consumption. Wobbling toward freedom. Jell-O in American immigration narratives. It's become serious scholarship, which would probably amuse Pearl Waite. The environmental criticism has intensified. The artificial ingredients, the animal-derived gelatin, the single-use packaging. Gen Z consumers want sustainability, transparency, plant-based alternatives. Everything Jell-O isn't. The company has introduced some vegan options, but they don't quite wobble the same. Regional differences persist stubbornly. The Midwest still serves Jell-O salads unironically. The South still adds marshmallows to everything. The coasts treat it as kitsch or childhood memory. These patterns have held for 50 years, culture encoded in collagen. The nursing home connection is poignant. For many elderly Americans, Jell-O is one of the last foods they can manage. Easy to swallow, gentle on digestion, familiar taste of younger days. It bookends American lives. First solid food for babies, last food before the end. Contemporary artists have embraced Jell-O as medium. Sculptures that melt, installations that decompose, performance art involving wrestling and kiddie pools full of it. The wobble as metaphor for instability and permanence. American decline, or just because it's weird and gets attention. The recipe books have become collectibles. Those 1950s pamphlets selling for hundreds on eBay. Museums mounting exhibitions about Jell-O advertising. The Jell-O Museum in Leroy getting serious visitors, historians, artists, ironists, nostalgists, all making pilgrimages to the birthplace of wobble. Food trucks now serve artisanal Jell-O shots. Craft cocktail bars offer elevated aspects. Brooklyn hipsters throwing Jell-O mold parties, completely sincere or completely ironic. Nobody's quite sure anymore, including them. The line between appreciation and mockery has dissolved like powder in hot water. Current sales data shows Jell-O holding steady but not growing. The customer base aging with limited youth replacement, except during exam weeks when college students buy it for shots, and Halloween when everyone needs it for intestines. Seasonal spikes in an otherwise flat market. The immigrant story continues evolving. New Americans from Asia and Africa encountering Jell-O with the same confusion as earlier waves. Some adapting it to their cuisines, bubble tea Jell-O, jollof rice Jell-O experiments. Others rejecting it entirely as peak American weirdness. But perhaps the strangest development is Jell-O becoming heritage food. Families protecting grandmother's recipes like heirlooms. This is exactly how she made it, including the canned fruit cocktail and Cool Whip. Authenticity through artificiality, tradition through processing. The wellness influencers have discovered bone broth, essentially the same collagen that makes Jell-O, marketed as ancient wisdom, healing food, sold for $20 a quart. The ingredients Pearl Weight bought for pennies now repackaged as luxury. The circle of wobble complete. Looking at that TikTok video again, the young creator gagging at their lime seafood creation while millions watch. This is Jell-O's current state, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, iconic and obsolete. American as apple pie, but weirder. Much weirder. The story that started with European aristocrats boiling bones for days has led to this. A viral video of someone trying to eat hot dog Jell-O for internet points. Democracy achieved through degradation. The wobble democratized, memified, immortalized in pixels. What would Pearl Weight think, watching his failed cough syrup side project become this cultural artifact? This thing that everyone knows, many mock, some love, few understand. The $500 he got from Woodward looking like the deal of the century, or maybe he got out at exactly the right time. Because Jell-O hasn't just wiggled its way into American homes. It's wiggled into American identity. For better or worse, in sickness and health, through prosperity and depression, war and peace, sincerity and irony. It's always there, trembling, colorful, artificial, unchanging, uncertain, waiting in the pantry, ready to become whatever America needs it to be next. The wobble persists. It always has. It probably always will. Long after we're gone, archaeologists will find Jell-O packages in landfills, perfectly preserved, still promising to transform powder into party. And they'll wonder, as we wonder about ancient Romans making garum, what exactly were these people thinking? Maybe that's Jell-O's true triumph. It makes us all wonder, what are we thinking? And why does it still, after all these years, all these transformations, all these reinventions, wobble? The story of Jell-O is settling now, like powder in warm water, dissolving into something calmer, quieter. The bright colors are fading to pastels, the sharp edges softening, the urgency of history becoming memory. You've traveled from European kitchens where bones boiled for days, through Pearl Waite's failed experiments, past Woodward's desperate gambles. You've seen immigrants making fig Jell-O, Jack Benny spelling it out on the radio, Depression survivors stretching hope into wobble, space-age housewives suspending their dreams in line. All that movement, all that change, and yet the wobble remains constant. Something about that constancy feels reassuring tonight. The world transforms, cultures shift, but somewhere, in someone's refrigerator, Jell-O is still setting, still becoming what it's always been, uncertain but holding its shape. Your breathing is probably slower now than when we started. Your mind has been following these gentle curves of history, these soft edges of story. There's something soothing about tracking small things through time, watching them matter and not matter, succeed and fail. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, and that's okay. The night outside your window is quiet, or maybe it's not, but you can choose to notice the quiet parts, the spaces between sounds, like the spaces between thoughts, like that moment when liquid becomes solid but hasn't quite finished, suspended, trembling but stable. Your pillow is soft beneath your head, softer than gelatin, more yielding. The physics of comfort, the chemistry of rest, everything finding its natural state, including you. Maybe tomorrow you'll see Jell-O differently, in the grocery store, in a meme. Or maybe you'll forget all of this. Let it dissolve back into the general solution of knowledge, available when needed, dormant when not. Close your eyes if they're still open. Let the last images fade, copper molds and rainbow layers, church potlucks and TikTok videos. All of it receding, becoming background, becoming quiet. The temperature in your room is whatever it needs to be. Your blanket is the right weight. Your body knows what it needs, has always known. No decisions required, just gentle adjustment, natural as breathing. In the morning, there will be new things to think about. But right now, in this suspended moment, nothing needs your attention. You can wobble gently between waking and sleeping, Neither one nor the other, both and neither. Your thoughts are becoming less formed now, less structured, more liquid. That's what they're supposed to do, dissolve into dream logic. The transformation is natural, happens every night, has happened since humans first trusted the dark. Let go of any last tension, any last thought trying to stay solid. Let it all become warm and formless, ready to become whatever dreams want to make of it. The wobble is slowing, settling, stilling, becoming something quieter, something that doesn't need a name, doesn't need to remember what it was. Just rest, suspended in this moment, held by nothing, holding nothing, complete in your incompleteness. Tomorrow there will be other stories, other transformations. But tonight, just this, just rest, just the gentle dissolution of one day into the next. Sweet dreams.